you might think, well, they're getting into the Bible, it's going to be fine. But remember, their own language is in the devotionals that go with each day. And when we're talking about reading the Bible, most of the time, it's like one verse or two verses. You don't get into actual passages until later. But just as a broad overview, the very first plan that people get to, and you could do them in any order, but I'm assuming most people probably start with the first one. The very first plan basically just continues in the way that they're presenting this in the devotionals to use progressive language and framing on everything. So I'll read you just a couple of comments to give you an idea for how it sounds. And these are just across the 7 days. They said, quote, "The way Jesus called out the toxic religious and political systems turned history upside down." So someone might say, well, what's wrong with that? But if you understand the progressive culture, you know that religion, and especially Christianity, is toxic, considered toxic, as our political system. So it appears, once again, to make Jesus favor that view. Another day said, Jesus made friends with people just as they are and let himself be known just as he was too, authentic, trustworthy, the kind of friend we all long for. So, of course, Jesus made friends with people as they are, but progressives are likely to read this as Jesus accepts you for whoever you want to be, so be your authentic self. I mean, even that language of authentic is a cultural word that is used today to just say, hey, be whoever you think you are.
That's right. That's what the gender issue is all about, that authenticity.
Exactly. We have to be aware as Christians what these words mean. It's not just authentic in terms of genuine. It means something else in the progressive context. Another quote, it says, "The Samaritan stopped and cared for the Jew at his own expense, just like he would a neighbor, unlike the racist religious men who stepped over the beat up guy on their way to worship of all things." Again, it plays into the progressive view of the religious. And throughout these reading plans, there are constant digs at the quote unquote religious and the religious leaders. And I think a lot of Christians kind of miss the point here that when we're talking about religious leaders, it's true that the Pharisees were religious leaders in Jesus's day, but they're never explaining that whole context and why Jesus had a problem with the Pharisees. It wasn't because they were religious. It wasn't because they held too strongly to their convictions. It was because they were self-righteous and they were hypocritical. He was calling them out for some very specific reasons. It wasn't because they were too religious in their beliefs. But that's how he gets his campaign, twists all of this, and it makes people skeptical of anyone who belongs to so-called organized religion.
Right.
You know, any pastors who might be out there, who might be preaching God's word, they're going to see as religious people and religious leaders. How does that help the church when we continue to emphasize this idea that religious people are bad? So that day, plan 1, days 1 through 7, just continually goes through this kind of progressive framing.
Let me make a comment about the Good Samaritan. What's ironic about the positioning of that particular parable, if you will, in the text, and it's unfortunate because there's a heading there that says the Good Samaritan, and that's where people start. You don't start there. That's not the beginning of the context. The context is just above it, the 2 greatest commandments. And when Jesus gives both commandments, one of the legalists, the text says, wishing to justify himself, asks, who is my neighbor? And then Jesus' answer is, your neighbor is your greatest enemy. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. Point being, there is no possibility of adequate self-justification. We are all lost. So people take this as a morality parable, and there is moral application to it, like is being done here. But that isn't the reason that Jesus gave the account of the Good Samaritan. It was to demonstrate our fallenness and our inability to do what we were supposed to do. So, of course, that's not consistent with the progressive message at all, but it shows an example of the abuse of this very important event or teaching of Jesus about the Good Samaritan. It wasn't about how to be good. It was about how we are bad and how we desperately need forgiveness.